Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. Editor and journalist Kevin Gosztola joins the show to talk about the jailing of former U.S. Army intelligence analyst and whistleblower Chelsea Manning for her resistance to a grand jury investigating Wikileaks. Kevin has been reporting on Manning's case from the start, 2010, and has been a tireless advocate. Secret grand juries and investigations have been used against dissidents and activists for more than a century as a political tactic of repression, isolation, intimidation, and harassment. But there's also a long tradition of resistance. As Kevin wrote, quote, Chelsea Manning is carrying on this tradition through her bold defiance, unquote. And in Manning's own words, quote, I will not participate in a secret process that I morally object to, particularly one that's been historically used to entrap and persecute activists for protected political speech, unquote. We discuss what little information we have about the secret grand jury, speculate about other factors that might be affecting the timing of the Manning subpoena. We also talk about the wild political flip-flops on the left and the right on the subject, about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks publications before and after the 2016 election. We toss around some ideas on how the Trump-Russia investigation, aka Russiagate, might factor in. Finally, we discuss how Manning's well-being and her health-related needs, especially given the history, are the most important priorities and foremost in our minds. Kevin Gosztola is the managing editor of Shadowproof. He also produces and co-hosts the excellent weekly podcast with Ronnie Kolick, Unauthorized Disclosure. At the end of the podcast, I'll relay information from Chelsea Manning's support group on how you can contact her and support her legal defense fund. That information will also be in the show notes. We recorded this on March 11th, 2019. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So Kevin's been reporting on the situation with WikiLeaks and Manning from the start, back in 2010, and he's worked to keep the grassroots informed and organized and to see that Chelsea Manning was treated fairly and would get some kind of justice. And I can remember following Kevin's work back since then, and we are former colleagues too. Kevin's the managing editor of Shadowproof, where I did some work for them for a while, and that's where this podcast got its start. So we have a lot in common. But Kevin, let's just, the audience for this podcast there's a significant percentage of international audience. And, you know, they're very familiar with American foreign policy and with politics, but maybe not, you know, down to the level of detail that we are. So, you know, we can fill in a little bit of background, if you would, to set this up to talk about Chelsea's situation right now.
Yeah, well, first, I'm glad that the show's still going, and I know that we sort of parted our ways at Shadowproof, but it's good that you're still doing this remarkable work, and I'm glad to be able to be a guest on this show, though the occasion is a little bit dreary, so to speak, in the sense that, once again, Chelsea Manning is back in a jail cell, and in a jail cell because she's resisting this grand jury. And I do actually find it kind of ironic. I don't know what kind of statement it makes about our empire, but the fact that initially she was put in prison because she was speaking out, and she released these documents, around 500,000 documents, which, you know, we can briefly summarize here, to WikiLeaks, and she was blowing the whistle, you know, very generally speaking, to start off here, on war crimes and diplomatic misconduct and other questionable acts by U.S. government officials. And for that, she became someone who was a target of prosecution. And in that case, she was speaking out. and she was in trouble because she opened her mouth. But now she's in jail because she won't speak, because she's
Oh,
conscious.
right.
She's conscious that the government would like to twist whatever she has to say and use it for political purposes to target activists, whether it be or journalists. Whether it be people who have worked for WikiLeaks all the way up to the top, Julian Assange, or whether it be supporters of hers or potentially, activists who were involved in her advocacy campaign to help her while she was in prison. I think she's very aware that there are, even if they say this is what this is for, at any moment, they're going to be collecting information from her that could be used for whatever purpose.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned in your article is that it's not a new thing to resist a grand jury. There's in the last paragraph of your article, you say there's a tradition of resistance to grand juries in the United States, particularly when the goals of the grand jury were clearly unjust. The tradition goes all the way back to abolitionists who were fighting slavery in the 1800s. It includes activists targeted by COINTELPRO who were hauled before grand juries when Richard Nixon was president. Chelsea Manning is carrying on this tradition through her bold defiance. So for anybody who thinks that it's just a stunt or it's not. It's not just a stunt. In fact, I think Daniel Ellsberg was also talking about this on the vigil, the Unity for J vigil or some. I know I heard someone talking about how it was common to haul, I think during the McCarthy era too, to haul people, really political targets in front of grand juries. Um, so, you know, I think that history is important. I'm glad you added that in there.
Yeah, and I think, well, let's start with Daniel Ellsberg. Just very, I have a very cursory understanding of what went on, but to give a brief summary here, Daniel Ellsberg, of course, being the person who released the Pentagon Papers, and then Richard Nixon was president, and these Pentagon Papers that revealed a lot of what was going on, what the Pentagon knew about the status of the Vietnam War and how they were lying to the American people about its success. Having that out in the open infuriated Nixon. And so the FBI went into overdrive with its secret investigation. It used federal grand juries. It was targeting journalists who were involved in doing reporting. Nixon wanted to be able to not only prosecute and jail Daniel Ellsberg, but to also go after New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan and to go after others who were involved. There was also an organization called the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, that had people who were involved who I believe were targeted by subpoenas. And one of those individuals actually was Noam Chomsky, and these were people who, and Richard Falk was another one who people may be familiar with his name, and these were people who were involved in supporting the effort to publicize what was in the Pentagon Papers and to connect it with grassroots movements that were challenging the war, and so. This was something that was ongoing, and another way, this went hand in hand with a lot of the sort of COINTELPRO surveillance that was around, the way that the law enforcement was targeting people. In fact, Ben McDickian worked on the Pentagon Papers, and there was a really good story last year about how he, in fact, was targeted by the FBI through surveillance very, very closely, and the way in which they had been going after him, and were particularly interested in him because of his involvement in working on the papers. And so then if you extend it, if you go broader to history, what I was referencing in my post, again, I think you people who listen to your show are probably pretty educated people and might be interested. There's this article that is up on the People's Law Office website, which is this sort of collective or small legal group here in Chicago, where I'm based, that does a lot of work representing political activists who are engaged in dissent and who become targets of the state. And this lawyer, Michael Deutsch, he wrote a paper back in the 80s about, it was under the title, The Improper Use of the Federal Grand Jury, an Instrument for the Internment of Political Activists. And he's very smart about this. You can take this all the way back to as you were saying, you take this all the way back to the era of slavery, right after the Civil War, when abolitionists were really picking up their efforts. And back then they were using the juries to target people and haul them in and use them as threats to coerce. And then labor, early on in the early 1900s, when organizers were fighting for the 8-hour workday, it's clearly documented that they were using grand juries to try to break the movement for workers' rights that had become pretty strong. And then when you go into the 1960s and you look at what was happening with some of these new left groups, as they were broadly characterized, or the Black Panthers, or you look at other groups that were involved, the different independence movements, like the Puerto Rican independence movements, those kinds of groups, they were in fact hauled in before grand juries and investigated, and there were crimes that they that were trumped up, and they were asked to inform on each other. And then eventually, around this time, around the early 70s, around this period, the National Lawyers Guild and some of these other lawyers started perfecting this routine where you would just simply refuse to answer the questions, because what they found out is that that was the best way to thwart the grand jury, because there really wasn't any way to get around it. You would be hauled in there and you had no choice but to answer these questions. So from that point on, they started formulating this way that they could actually resist the grand jury, and we've seen it continue. And in fact, most vividly, though it has nothing to do with Chelsea Manning's case, I put her in this tradition. There were a few dozen activists back in 2010, almost around the same time that Chelsea was fighting her case against the government, that were from the Midwest, and they were targeted with subpoenas under President Obama's administration, and they were basically targets because of their organizing around the Republican National Convention. And these were also all activists that had done stuff around foreign policy, where they had been aligning with Palestinian rights groups, or they had been involved in sticking up for work towards peace, fighting paramilitary groups, standing up for left-wing groups in Colombia. And so this is something that she's in a long tradition. There's no this isn't just out of the blue somebody decided they're going to resist a grand jury. There's a lot of record of abuses by grand juries in this country. So she knows why she's standing on the right side of history by defying this grand jury.
Right. And, the other point that she made in one of her statements is that she's already told them on the record in a military court everything that she knows. She's, it's all available. I assume that's all available to them. That's all transcribed and, could be used by the prosecutors.
Yeah, and she knows exactly what the goal is of asking her to come to the grand jury. I can't remember if she had made a specific statement, but it's clear to me that what she's trying to avoid is her being put in a situation where they ask her questions about statements she made, and then she's in a position where she might open herself up to a perjury charge or some kind of maybe an obstruction of justice kind of a charge, something that's very technical but tends to happen if you slip up and you forget. And so, or maybe even a withholding evidence charge or something like that. Or if it would reveal some kind of conduct that was uncharged. I don't know if that could potentially lead to another trial, although she's been convicted of all these offenses. I don't know if it would be double jeopardy if they found some other crime, but then I suppose it raises the possibility of whether that would mean the military would then have to prosecute her again. But as you can see, as I run the stream of consciousness, there's all these different things that you wouldn't want to allow prosecutors to do to you. And though I think it's really important to say here that, like on one hand, in her statement, she was very clear that Julian Assange, she was not 100% sure she was ever talking to Julian when they exchanged chats. It could have been somebody else. She mentioned somebody named Daniel. And then she mentioned that it could have been a third person. So it was never 100% confirmed to her that she was communicating with Julian Assange. And then two, she made it very clear that I made this decision on my own. I wanted to release this documents, but what they really want from her is some kind of evidence that it was Julian Assange or it was somebody else within WikiLeaks who said, hey, what kind of documents do you have in these databases that you can release to us? Because they want to get Julian Assange on the gathering process. They're very adamant here because they know about the legal issues and how it probably wouldn't survive a constitutional test if they targeted the publication. So they're trying to target the gathering of the news, which is still as dangerous for press freedom. It doesn't clear out those issues. We're still, if you care about freedom of the press, you still have to be concerned about the fact that prosecutors would even contemplate trying to go after journalists for the way they gather news. Because, really honestly, ask yourself, do you want the government deciding what is proper and improper, legal and illegal in the way of gathering? I mean, obviously, I'm not suggesting that I want to be allowed to hack into institutions and grab secret documents. But what I'm saying is, if I have a source that comes to me who's a whistleblower and I find out what they're describing to me and I say to them, well, if you're able to get me proof of that, if you had access to some kind of documentation and we were able to publish it, I think we could really help you. If you go by the theory that the government seems to be wanting to go by, that might be soliciting a leak. So am I guilty of a crime? Would I be open to prosecution? And I think that's why people should be concerned about what the Trump Justice Department is trying to do here.
Yeah, exactly. And, I've not been in that situation, so I can't say firsthand, but I feel pretty confident that that kind of situation happens all the time with sources, framed exactly the way that you just framed it. And in other ways too, maybe even journalists going a little further, like, well, hey, can you get this? Can you get that? Can you get more? I bet it happens all the time. So yeah, the whole premise here is that the Department of Justice is afraid to prosecute WikiLeaks for publishing because there's all kinds of First Amendment rights, but they're even more worried that the big media outlets here in the States and their friends at the media even will be it'll set a precedent so that they can charge the New York, it's called the New York Times problem or something. But I think they're also, maybe even more so, the definitely the New York Times someone in their legal department spoke out against, they indicated that they would not be happy at all if Julian Assange was prosecuted for publishing these documents. They know what the climate is. They know the media would not be happy with them for that. So not only would the media not be happy with them, and not only would they create this New York Times problem where precedent could be set, they're going to have really bad media coverage. They're going to get a lot of pushback. And I think that their relationship, particularly the intelligence community, their relationship with the media is really important to them. It's crucial to them. So they just don't want to go down that road. So if they can find another way, as Kevin said, in the gathering process, if they can come up with some kind of a conspiracy there and get Julian, they don't care what they get Julian Assange on. And they've been thinking for not, 8, I guess going on 9 years now, of every possible way they could get him. So, and then maybe this is a good time to bring up, because the timing is interesting. It's an interesting story. Like, why now? There are a whole bunch of different things that play into it. It's even more complicated now than it was back in 2010 because we have Russiagate, and we have lots of people who really want to, even more people who used to, many of them used to support Julian Assange when he was leaking documents on the Bush administration and even the Obama administration. Um, you know, they blame him for the 2016 election, which is kind of ridiculous in my view. But then even on top of that, my belief is that, or what I think is that I heard that WikiLeaks had never released any CIA related documents until March 2017, when Julian Assange released the Vault 7 documents. And that's when things really heated up, in my view. And that may be when they decided they were sort of renewed in their intent to get him. So, like, there's all kinds of things. I guess the other big factor is Ecuador. It took time to for Korea to be out of office, to get a more friendly administration into Ecuador, and then they had to work out this whole situation where they, I guess you could say, just bribed them with IMF loans, and I don't know, strong armed them. So it's hard to know like why this is all happening right now, but that's my view of what the big factors are. Am I missing anything there, Kevin?
No, I think that leads into some critical questions about what is playing out. And we don't really know, and it's hard for me to say definitively, but what I can add to the points that you're raising is first that on Ecuador, I think that the pressure is there to find some kind of resolution. We've known in the past few weeks that there was this news story about Australia apparently giving Julian Assange back his passport.
Oh,
And there was this thing about how officials were meeting with him. And I don't know what's going to come of this. At the same, certainly he has to leave the embassy, and we don't know what would happen if he exited the embassy. There is a charge on violating bail conditions that the United Kingdom still has on the books and claims it would like to be able to still pursue and resolve, even though that's a very relatively minor kind of an offense. It's nothing serious. So it amounts to being more of like a political thing that like they're going to keep it there in existence. But it's obvious that this government that's running, that is more centrist, if not right wing, in Ecuador would really very much like to get Julian Assange off their hands. But at the same time, I think that they have to worry about their own credibility, because political asylum is something that they, unlike our country, take very seriously. And so to have granted it to someone and then to go back on the promise and not really carry it out, I wonder if it would do something to their image to not be able to succeed in this asylum. So that's one issue. But then to why this grand jury is playing out the way that it's playing out, and I honestly agree with people who might be baffled that they're focused on the 2010
yeah.
releases and not later releases, because it would seem that there are more legally murky acts there, and there's more conduct that people related, or maybe even Julian Assange, we don't know. There are things that are harder to understand, and they're more, it's conduct that exists more in a gray area. And I'm not saying I support its criminalization, but it certainly makes it much more difficult for someone like me to build a defense, because you have to work overtime to figure out I mean, I have to probably just take it from a principled standpoint of the fact that Julian Assange has been a target ever since 2010. For them to bring any case against him, it's going to be political no matter what they find. Even if it does, even if there is evidence of a criminal offense, it would still be a political prosecution because, from the last 10 years, they've done everything they can to make it almost impossible for WikiLeaks to function. So they've driven them in a direction where they would become a hostile organization, even though, I think that's a natural way in which a news or media organization should operate. I mean, I don't have any good feelings toward the Trump administration. I would say I'm a rather hostile journalist towards Donald Trump. So I don't really know why Mike Pompeo gets to say that WikiLeaks is a hostile intelligence organization, and that disqualifies them because to some extent, if journalists behave like hostile intelligence agents, they might actually be pretty effective journalists. To be quite honest.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think to Russiagate is, so we know that Donald Trump was fairly happy to be able to see WikiLeaks publish those Podesta emails. And so I think that there is this issue for his administration and his base, which is that many of them do have favorable views of WikiLeaks. And I have to say that one of the strangest developments in my consistent coverage of Chelsea Manning's case and WikiLeaks over the past 10 years is this flip, is going from having mostly left-wing progressive people follow your work early in 2010, 11, all the way up to 2015. And then when the Podesta emails hit, when there's all these allegations of being some kind of cutout or having some kind of work with an intelligence asset from Russia or something or other. And then you go onward into 2017 and then 2018 to now, you have a lot of people in the right who lurk around on the conservative blogs who see a value in WikiLeaks. And then you have the people who are liberal, left of center, who see them as something very they see it as a threat to national security now, and they talk like Mike Pompeo, and they view Julian Assange in the way that the national security state views WikiLeaks. And then, of course, you still have, but it's a smaller faction, I'd say, you still have a few left-wing activists who are willing to support. So you have successfully reduced all support for WikiLeaks to the political fringes.
Yeah, right. And it really is bizarre land to have gone through this. And the other odd thing is that back in the spring of 2017, for both WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, things were looking good. Trump had expressed, he was happy with WikiLeaks. It looked like maybe he would at least not be as harsh on them. Although, the Obama administration didn't prosecute him, but they did bring up the grand jury. And everyone thought that they were after them all through the Obama administration, but still, it looked like things might be a little bit more favorable for Assange. And also for Chelsea Manning, her sentence was commuted. She was going to be released from jail, and it looked like this nightmare was going to be over. And now we're back. I feel like we're right back to the way things were in 2010. And the people who we have in place, it's, back in 2010, I have an audio clip here of John Bolton. Well, first, on November 29th of 2010, I have a quote here. John Bolton talked to the National Review Online, a conservative media organization. And I have a quote here. Former Ambassador John Bolton tells National Review Online that he would charge Private Bradley Manning, it was Bradley Manning at the time, with treason for sharing U.S. intelligence with Wikileaks. And Bolton's quote is, quote, "I believe treason is still punishable by death, and if he were found guilty, I would do it," Bolton says, right? So, and then I believe this audio clip is from a documentary of him saying pretty much the same thing. Let me just play that.
What do you think of Bradley Manning?
I think he committed treason. I think he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
What does that mean?
Well, treason is the only crime defined by our Constitution, and it says treason shall consist only of levying war against the United States or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And he gave our enemies a lot of aid and comfort.
So what should happen to him?
Well, he should be prosecuted, and if he's found guilty, he should be punished to the fullest extent possible.
And what is that?
Death.
You think he should be killed?
Yes.
So that's how John Bolton felt in 2010. Now, the one thing I did not research is whether he changed. I doubt he softened all through this time. He might be the one person who's been consistent on Manning and WikiLeaks throughout this whole thing. But we have him in a powerful position in this administration. And then we have Mike Pompeo, who, ironically, I guess it was during the campaign, expressed that he liked WikiLeaks. But on March 7th, as I said, Assange released Vault 7. And I should mention that during this time, he was in some type of backdoor negotiations with the Trump administration and with Waldman and I think some former Obama administration. And, they were trying to work out some kind of a deal where he could leave the embassy at least to testify safely. And maybe even a better outcome for him. But that all fell through. And Pompeo, at the time, had just become the CIA director. And his very first statement, the very first speech he ever made was at CSIS. And he came out with this.
Individuals such as Julian Assange and Edward Snowden seek to use that information to make a name for themselves. As long as they make a splash, they care nothing about the lives they put at risk or the damage they cause to national security. WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service. It has encouraged its followers to find jobs at the CIA in order to obtain intelligence. It's time to call out WikiLeaks for what it really is: a non-state hostile intelligence service often abetted by state actors like Russia. In January of this year, our intelligence community determined that Russian military intelligence, the GRU, had used WikiLeaks to release data of U.S. victims that the GRU had obtained through cyber operations against the Democratic National Committee. And the report also found that Russia's primary propaganda outlet, RT, has actively collaborated with WikiLeaks. Assange and his ilk make common cause with dictators today. Yes, they try unsuccessfully to cloak themselves and their actions in the language of liberty and privacy, but in reality, they champion nothing but their own celebrity. Their currency is clickbait, their moral compass non-existent, their mission, personal self-aggrandizement through destruction of Western values. They do not care about the causes of the people they claim to represent. If they did, they would focus instead on autocratic regimes in this world that actually suppress free speech and dissent. Instead, they choose to exploit the legitimate secrets of democratic governments, which has, so far, proven to be a much safer approach than provoking a tyrant.
So this is in April of 2017, and Pompeo comes out, guns blazing against WikiLeaks. So they're back in the crosshairs. But then, nothing happens for a while, and, now here we are. They're calling up Chelsea Manning. The only questions, she says in a statement, the only questions they asked her were about the events of 2010. They didn't even have anything to do with everything that's happened since then. So, yeah, it's very puzzling has this grand jury it was convened back in 2010. What, true? Are we sure of that?
That's true. What we don't know because of the secrecy surrounding it is when it's ended and restarted and how many times it may have ended and restarted. you know, if I have to go back and correct myself, I will. It's possible that one of my colleagues who had been in the court room with me, Alexa O'Brien, has a database of documents and has done as well as anybody possibly could to obtain documents about a very secretive process. To my knowledge, though, I don't know if there are sort of notices about each of the dates in which this grand jury has started. And I don't know if we know when this current cycle for this grand jury began, which is good and bad, because on one hand, the fact that it restarted, the fact that it came again, and they are pursuing this investigation, bringing people to the grand jury, some of them that have already received subpoenas earlier back in, let's say, 2011. For example, David House, who was a Manning Support Network person who was out there advocating for Chelsea Manning, he was asked to go to the grand jury back in 2011. He came and was subpoenaed again and was hauled before this grand jury. Apparently, this round, he decided to answer some of the questions when back in 2011 he had refused to answer any sort of questions and instead invoked his rights the same way that Manning did. And then now today, what we don't know is when this began. And so it's possible that it's been going on for many months. So I've seen people say, well, Chelsea Manning could be in jail for up to 18 months because that's the cycle for the grand jury. And it could be that she's actually only in jail for 5 or 6 months because maybe it's already been going for a year and they could be finished up fairly soon. However, the problem with this whole process, as you can tell, since it's been ongoing since 2010, is that you can keep starting. And I also believe, according to some legal experts, that one of the ways that they've gotten around possible statute of limitations or possible issues in the elapse of time is by filing these secret charges against Julian Assange. So they don't really have their case fully built, but they're leaving the opening for prosecuting him, which then gives them the ability to still compile a case, and that breeds uncertainty. And there's all these sort of like questions about what exactly their timeline is for trying to pursue a case. But regardless of those unknowns, what we do know and what is abundantly clear is the politics of all this. We know that going back to 2017, around the time that Mike Pompeo was making these statements, that it's actually the Democrats who are upset about the way in which the election unfolded after the Podesta emails, and they're concerned about whatever evidence they believe might be out there, even though they don't have it. They believe that there must be something out there that ties Donald Trump to Russia and that WikiLeaks was somehow helping. So this conviction, this belief that somehow WikiLeaks is now an adversary of the United States, makes them more hardened in their opposition to WikiLeaks, to the point where they're really working through Mike Pompeo to ensure that he holds Trump to a standard that had been accepted in government for the last decade, which is that under no circumstances could you consider that WikiLeaks was a legitimate media organization. They must be demonized. They must be treated as if, the security agencies of our government were watching them every step of the way and even willing to engage in activities that would disrupt their ability to conduct their news gathering, to conduct their publishing activities. And so I think that's the big point, is that you've seen within the CIA a willingness to hold on to targeting WikiLeaks, even when Donald Trump seemingly doesn't have that much of an appetite for it. And basically, because they're so committed, if you just maintain your commitment, you're able to outlast Donald Trump. That's what we've seen in his administration. Is he doesn't have much stamina when it comes to, the only thing he really is willing to push and push and push for is this border wall. But everything else, he folds pretty easily after institutions resist, as we've seen with the withdrawal around Syria, and as we've seen with some other foreign policy issues. And I think WikiLeaks falls into the same bucket here, because ultimately he's decided that he's going to go along with what the CIA wants. And I believe, again, to reiterate my point, that a lot of what the CIA is pushing for is reinforced by the Democratic Party and then part of the Republican Party, which frankly is probably baffled that they elected a president who ever was, decently amazed or impressed by the work of WikiLeaks.
Yeah, it's the same fight, the same 2016 election fight. And at this point in time, when Pompeo made this statement in the spring of 2017, if you remember, when Trump took office, he was at war with the intelligence agencies. And like if not the first thing he did, one of the first things he did was he visited the CIA headquarters, and he gave some kind of very conciliatory speech. And the task at that time, I believe, was to try to patch things up between Trump and the intelligence agencies. But I don't know how successful they were. I don't know how. He still doesn't seem to, he doesn't trust them still. But anyway, I guess it's a possibility that conceding on WikiLeaks, to become hostile toward WikiLeaks, maybe that was a concession he made. We don't know that. He doesn't seem to have a very good handle over his own Justice Department, his own intelligence agencies, and his foreign policy. He gives orders, and then the people around him find ways to walk it back. He eventually gives in. So, it's a pattern. It's just, as you pointed out, it's kind of a pattern. The other pattern is, he will throw his former allies under the bus. We can see that. He'll say, oh, I don't even know them that well, or he'll even go after them whole hog, as he has done with other people. And, it's possible that they just want to get Julian Assange, they don't care how. Just get him out of that embassy, for one, get him over here, and they feel confident that they'll be able to, detain him indefinitely or find some way to, bring some kind of charges against him. And if it's in the Eastern District of Virginia, he'll never win. No one ever does. And so there's that hope. But I find it hard that, even though we know that the questions that they asked Chelsea are back in 2010 and 2011, I find it hard to believe that these other newer events are not part of the bigger picture. So,
well, it would depend. We just don't know the scope of the investigation. We don't know. I would presume that when it launched the grand jury, they had a set of things that they were going to investigate, and it may be broad. It could be a little bit more specific. It could relate to a time frame, but it seems like there should be some kind of parameter for why the grand jury was launched. And we don't know exactly. All we do know is that David House was talking to the Washington Post and said that the questions were about the war logs from Iraq and Afghanistan, which, to quickly refresh your listeners' memory, were tremendous resources for people who wanted to understand more truths about what was happening with the war. I mean, the Iraq Body Count Project found somewhere around 15,000 more civilian deaths that had gone unreported as a result of this collection of data, these military incident reports. And it revealed, as far as Iraq goes, that there was this sort of order that existed called Frago 242, with, I think, David Petraeus even involved. And the idea was that the U.S. military was not going to do anything to hold Iraqi military forces accountable if they engaged in torture. So they had a green light to engage as a proxy force that rounded up people within Iraq and tortured them within the country. And then we also know that in Afghanistan, as a result of those war logs, this was in 2010. We have to remember that we had not had the whole proliferation of drone warfare yet, where everyone was debating and talking about it and warning about the way in which Barack Obama was institutionalizing this assassination program. But what we had was assassination squads within Afghanistan, and one of them was Task Force 373. One of the incidents that was able to be detailed and accounted for involved an attack on a Quran school in Afghanistan that left some children dead. And so this is a very important set of information. Many of these, almost all of the reports that came from this collection were historical. And so there's no threat to the military in Afghanistan or Iraq. And in fact, one could argue that, I remember with the Iraq set, that they could actually be valuable to protecting soldiers who had been deployed. So I'm no pro-empire person, I'm no pro-occupation, but I do know that there was someone who did a whole thing about how they could predict where IEDs would blow up against soldiers because there was enough data that you could see where these insurgent groups were targeting people. So this is a really crucial set of information.
Yeah, for sure. And even today, people are still going back to WikiLeaks files. Now, we should be clear that WikiLeaks has released many other things in addition to the trove of documents that Manning gave to WikiLeaks. But even if we just think about just the Manning documents, it's still being used by all kinds of researchers all across the world, media organizations all across the world, and the cables. I mean, things come up all the time. It's almost become part of a procedure if you're an investigative reporter or a researcher of any kind. That's one of the archives that you go and you look at. You go and you search the WikiLeaks archive for whatever subject you're researching. And I know that it came up, useful things came up during the Syrian war, which is, by some accounts, one of the worst, most misleadingly reported wars in recent memory. And, we for instance, we learned some things from cables about, when the regime change operation in Syria really started, years before it was reported. Supposedly we didn't get involved until 2014, and some people said 2012. Well, yeah, it was much earlier than that. So, yeah, I don't disagree with any of the points you made there. There's just a couple more things I wanted to bring up, and well, I guess I want to talk about, Chelsea's well-being, wrap up with that. But there's also the elephant in the room, the Mueller probe, which still isn't. Mueller was looking at WikiLeaks too. Mueller indicted some Russian intelligence operatives. In my view, there's still no hard evidence that the Russians hacked the DNC and all. And I don't know if we've ever been I don't even want to get into this rabbit hole of of how the documents may have gotten from the Russians to WikiLeaks, because I frankly don't buy their story at the moment. Some people report it because it's in an indictment. They look at that as hard proven evidence, but it isn't. It's an indictment. It's an allegation, an assertion. But this grand jury is it possible that this is a Mueller grand jury?
I highly doubt that this is part of the Mueller investigation simply because they're concerned about these releases from nearly 10 years ago. I just have to believe that if there was something related to Russiagate, which would make liberal Democrats ecstatic, or if there was something around the publication of CIA materials, it's not to say that they wouldn't be interested. All of these things that we're talking about, by the way, become what in legal jargon is called aggravating evidence, in the sense that if Julian Assange ever was put on trial in the United States, and it would be a political prosecution, were he to come here, once they charge him for the crimes, then when you go to your sentencing, if he had not accepted a plea deal, which he probably wouldn't, because I bet Julian would be someone who would like to confront the United States government and
he'd want to go to trial.
Really, want to make a spectacle out of it, really want the world to see that this is what the U.S. government is doing to a publisher. And when you get to sentencing, then they would be able to raise all those things. They could raise the actions that he took around the Vault 7. He could raise the actions that were taken around the Podesta emails. And then that can be part of it. But so far, if I see Chelsea Manning and David House and people like that, and Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who was long as a partner of Julian Assange, long been out of the picture because they don't get along. They hated each other. They parted ways back, 8 or 9 years ago, very officially. And so it just, that can't be part of what is going on, in my opinion. Before we get to Chelsea's,
that makes a lot of sense.
Before we get to Chelsea's well-being, though, I just wanted to squeeze in here a quick mention because it goes back to the influence of the CIA. I just want to remind people that when Chelsea got out of prison, you might remember this episode, but in 2017, she wanted to go to the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. She was invited to be a visiting fellow.
Oh, yeah.
But then Mike Morrell actually led this pressure campaign, and Mike Pompeo was even involved, canceled his appearance at the school, and he wrote a letter to the Harvard Kennedy School and said, Miss Manning betrayed her country and was found guilty of 17 serious crimes for leaking classified information to WikiLeaks. Indeed, Miss Manning stands against everything the brave men and women I serve alongside stand for. And of course, Mike Morrell then was involved in saying that he was going to have to distance himself from the organization because he was part of some smaller institution within Harvard Kennedy, I believe. And he thought that this was legitimizing a sort of criminal path that she had took to prominence, and that it might encourage others to leak classified information as well. And so I just remind people of this because I think it speaks to how much of an influence the CIA really has over the way in which WikiLeaks is being targeted.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's indicative of how they really will never forgive that, they will always be a target in their view. And one more thing before we get to Chelsea, the argument that this grand jury is asking questions about the 2010 relitigating, to some extent, what was already done in a military court, and therefore it indicates it's probably not having to do anything with Russiagate. I think that makes perfect sense. But then I think about Manafort. Manafort was tried for things and found convicted of things that had nothing to do with the 2016 election at all. So it's hard to know, the heck they're doing, because they'll basically get them on anything they can from any that seems to be that wide ranging.
Well, I would buy that they might have a general permission to just look at whatever they can get. Grand juries in general are fishing expeditions. They they don't know what they're looking for. They just know that they want to get somebody, and they're trying to find crimes. And they think generally that a group of people were involved, but they don't know who. And the process is to turn people against each other. And that's part of the process that Chelsea Manning is resisting. That's why she is in jail, is because honestly, the investigators should be able to have more of a targeted understanding of who they think is guilty, in the same sense of like, if somebody commits a murder, then you go like very close to or in and around the people who were associated with that person, and you go outward and you try to find people who were accused, who could possibly have been involved in that murder before you go out to, random people and all that. And then here it's like they're going after people and they don't really know like if anybody around them committed the crimes that they could possibly prosecute in a court of law and get away with without getting around the Constitution. They just know that they really adamantly want to charge somebody in and around WikiLeaks. And so they're trying to hunt for something, anything they could find. So like you said, I mean, if they were found it, maybe they could just get someone in the United States on like a tax fraud charge because they were involved in investigating these people and they found some kind of evidence of that. But it would just be in the process of targeting these WikiLeaks people. I mean, it's possible that somebody could find themselves in a case that was political, that had nothing to do with why this grand jury was started in the first place, which is why Chelsea has no incentive to answer any of these questions.
Yeah, it actually strengthens her reasoning, in my view, from just resisting it. And speaking of Chelsea, so you quoted John Kiriakou in your article, where he mentions that Chelsea was in prison for 6 years, and 2 of those years were in solitary confinement. And we know some of the details about that, and they're horrific. Meanwhile, she's a transgender woman. It's a difficult time for her. She wants to transition, and you're not treated very well in military prison if you are in this position. And anyway, it really gets to me. Just the thought of what she went through. So, but Kiriakou says, that he was in prison for 23 months and never in solitary, and he came out of it with PTSD. So, he's speculating that she has a lot of trauma to deal with. And she's only been out since May of 2017, not even 2 years. And now she's back in prison. So, I think everybody's worried. A lot of people are saying, what it shows the kind of courage that she has. And I agree with that. But, it's very worrisome because is she going to be I should mention too, her attorney urged the court here. I'm going to quote Kevin again. Manning's attorney, Maura Meltzer-Cohen, urged the court to place Manning in home confinement so her health could be taken care of properly, and the court refused. And I don't understand that, why they couldn't put her under house arrest. Like, I really don't understand that. So, I don't know. You have thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, briefly, as we're nearing the end here, I think this is probably the most crucial thing to be focused upon, is whether her needs as far as mental health care and then other health treatment that may go towards whether she's supposed to be getting regular hormone therapy or whether there was something involved in her transitioning that she's still trying to complete. And this is very personal matter, right? Like, we don't know medically
Right.
what Chelsea Manning was doing with her doctor the last 2 years, nor do we need to know. But we just basically very generally understand that within a prison, and I know this from covering extensively facilities throughout the United States, that being in prison is the worst place to be when you're in need of health care, because it is nearly impossible to get adequate health treatment in any of these facilities. Some of them have private contractors, some of them don't. But in all cases, these facilities want to spend as little money as possible on prisoners to give any sort of treatment. Not to mention that right now, under a grand jury investigation, facing a subpoena and contempt of court because she did not comply with the subpoena, investigators, whether they think the prison will do this intentionally or not, know that one of the pressures that Manning faces, which could make her buckle, is the fact that she needs this kind of health care and would want to be outside of jail to get the health care. And so maybe they might be privately hoping that Manning would be denied health treatment for psychological issues that she's been dealing with for several years, for things related to her gender identity, for things related to her being a transgender woman. And I think that they might be hoping that the prison perhaps breaks her yet again in the same way that prison broke her when she was at Leavenworth. Let's not forget that she attempted suicide when she was there. This was months, just a matter of months before Barack Obama gave her that commutation. And we know that there was torture, what a UN special rapporteur called cruel and inhuman treatment while she was at Quantico. It eventually became the only time that she got substantial days of credit for her sentence, because she had what was described by the military as unlawful pretrial punishment that reduced her sentence by a little more than 100 days. And so we know the record here of trauma that she's had from being in jail. And I think that it's not unreasonable for us to say, because of how these grand juries function, that these prosecutors might be banking on the pressure of jail, making her come back to the grand jury and agree to answer these questions to turn against Julian Assange. But, let me end on a positive note, because that might sound kind of bleak. I think she's a pretty strong woman, and that she's somebody who stands on principle. And I don't believe that anybody in the Justice Department is going to get her to abandon her effort to resist this grand jury. I would predict that because through her organization, Chelsea Resists, she's already raised somewhere around $35,000, maybe $40,000 as of March 11th. That she's going to be able to raise this money for her legal defense. She's going to be able to remain a prisoner who's a political prisoner at this point, who's in the press. She's going to be able to call attention to the abusive nature of this grand jury. She's going to be in the news. She's going to inspire reporters at establishment news media organizations to care about this grand jury, to debate it, to consider the ramifications of it, its threat to press freedom. And that on its own is a threat to the government. And so, if you want to get people to forget everything that you're doing to go after Julian Assange, you abandon your effort to try to get Chelsea Manning to testify. I think it's in the interests of the U.S. empire to let Chelsea Manning go and find another way to get Julian Assange without her. That they believe they need to go through her to get to Julian Assange just shows how ruthless and cunning they are.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kevin. And the whole thing just reeks of vengeance, all around. And I mean, if we've seen anything, it's that this kind of vengeance has done nothing but hurt the people who tried to use it to their advantage. And I hope that, I'm going to second everything you just said, and I appreciate it. Anything else we should touch on before we wrap up here?
No, I mean, I just would add for your listeners that I'll be following this closely as I have all along. And so there'll be updates at shadowproof.com as they are necessary. At the moment, what we know about Chelsea Manning's confinement conditions on March 11th is that she may or may not be in general population yet. And once she's in general population, then it becomes easier for people to send her mail. I believe if you want to, I could get you the address for it, or you could let people know if they want to write to Chelsea at the end of this episode. You could give them the address. But she's got an address where she could receive mail. And so far, she hasn't been able to see visitors, but that's not necessarily because the jail is being just, brutal toward her. It means that basically she hasn't been in general population yet, and so she can't see visitors. And that's a standard bureaucratic procedure. But eventually, there will be activists who are visiting her, and they'll be calling attention to her case, and that's going to put pressure on the government to abandon what they're doing.
Agreed. And, thanks for the work you've done. This isn't the first time that you helped people know, what they can and can't do and how they can write to, Chelsea in the past, Kiriakou when he was in prison. And I just always admired the work that you've done on that. Please let everybody know where to find you, how to support your work, how to support Shadowproof, and all of that.
Yeah, so if you go to shadowproof.com, you can find all of our work there. If for some reason you're compelled to, in addition to supporting this great podcast Around the Empire, if you're able to support Around the Empire and Shadowproof, we are always eager to have new members. We're always eager to have just donors who want to throw a couple bucks our way to keep this kind of journalism going. I was hoping to get you all this address. You mind if I pause for a moment here and just? I'm gonna throw in this.
Is it the same stuff that was out on Twitter that her ex-wife Chelsea?
Yeah, I think so. Are you going to go back and read it for people?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll put it in. I still have to record an intro and an outro, and I have show notes too. So as long as it hasn't changed.
Why don't you here? I'll go back and do this so I don't end funky. Okay.
Okay. Also, don't forget to mention your podcast.
Right. Let me get my my personal details right.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you want to go to shadowproof.com and in addition to supporting this wonderful podcast Around the Empire, if you can support it and support Shadowproof, there's a way for you to become a member if that's something you're interested in supporting the journalism, or you can just throw a few bucks our way by donating to keep this kind of journalism going. And then I'm a co-host and producer of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, which I've been doing for about 5-6 years now. And so again, like if you've got extra time in your schedule, in addition to Around the Empire, I encourage you to see some of our episodes. We've been really hitting Venezuela closely, so if that's something you're interested in, which might appeal to people who listen to Around the Empire, you can see that show. So thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, Joanne.
Okay, Kevin, it's great to see you. Talk to you soon. And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Kevin Gosztola. Follow Kevin on Twitter at kgosztola. Find his work at shadowproof.com and subscribe to his excellent podcast with Ronnie Colick, Unauthorized Disclosure. Chelsea Manning's legal defense fund can be found at xychelsea.is. While she's in jail, her friends and volunteers are managing her Twitter account at xychelsea and her support committee Twitter account at resistchelsea. They publish an address where she can receive letters. They note that the jail does not accept books or cards, but it's Chelsea Elizabeth Manning, A0181426, William G. Truesdale Adult Detention Center, 2001 Mill Road, Alexandria, Virginia, 22314. And all of this information is in the show notes for your reference. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build out the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. Follow us on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire. The audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire, where we have the most traffic. There are many ways to listen to it. Find it, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, or listen to it on the website aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm working on a new look and some new kinds of content, including video live streams, mini docs, and the like, and I'd really need your help to build up that YouTube channel. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Peace.